well over 2 millennia before biology made any effective advance on this notion, with Darwin's theory of evolution. By now, Aristotle had acquired a reputation as the leading intellectual throughout Greece. Philip of Macedon had recently overrun Greece, for the first time uniting its bickering city-states into one sovereign country, and he invited Aristotle to become tutor to his unruly young son Alexander. As Aristotle's father had been personal physician and friend to Philip's father, Aristotle was considered one of the family, and he felt obliged to accept this regal offer. Reluctantly, he set out for the Macedonian capital of Pella. Nowadays, Pella is little more than a field of stones, with some pebble mosaics and half a dozen columns beside the busy main road from Thessaloniki to the western Greek border. It is a surprisingly unimpressive spot, considering that this was the first capital of ancient Greece, and later, after Alexander the Great launched his campaign to conquer the world, it could even have claimed to be the first and last capital of the known world. Here in 343 BC, one of the finest minds the world has ever known set about trying to educate one of the greatest megalomaniacs the world has ever known. Aristotle was 42 years old. Alexander was 13. But not surprisingly, it was Alexander who won hands down. The headstrong young pupil learned absolutely nothing from his tutor during the 3 years of their association, or so the story goes. Aristotle was convinced of the superiority of the Greeks to all other races. In his eyes, the finest leader would be a Homeric hero such as Achilles, whose mind had been exposed to the latest advances in Greek civilization. And he believed that in man's mind lay an ability to subdue the entire world. There's no denying that Alexander bore an uncanny resemblance to this blueprint, even if he did not turn out quite as Aristotle might have wished. But we can only speculate on this meeting of minds, about which curiously little is known. What is known is that in payment for his services, Aristotle asked Philip to rebuild his birthplace Stagira, which had inadvertently been reduced to rubble during one of Philip's recent campaigns in the Halkidiki Peninsula. And there is evidence that while Alexander was on his great expedition of conquest, he sent back assorted unknown plants and a zoo of exotic animals for his old tutor to classify. Horticultural lore has it that this was how the first rhododendrons reached Europe from Central Asia. If so, Aristotle must have misclassified this species. Rhododendron means rose tree in ancient Greek. In 336 BC, Philip of Macedon was assassinated, and the 16-year-old Alexander assumed the throne. After speedily executing all other possible claimants, and embarking on a few preliminary blitzkrieg campaigns through Macedonia, Albania, up through Bulgaria and across the Danube and down through Greece, reducing Thebes to a smoking ruin en route, Alexander set off on his campaign to conquer the known world. In practice, this included North Africa and Asia as far as Tashkent and northern India. Fortunately, Aristotle's geography lessons hadn't included China, whose existence was unknown to the West at this time. Meanwhile, Aristotle had returned to Stagira. But before he had left Pella, Aristotle had recommended his cousin Callisthenes to Alexander for the position of court intellectual. This act of generosity was to prove all but fatal for Aristotle. Callisthenes was a bit of a blabbermouth, and Aristotle warned him about talking too much at court before he left. When Alexander set out on his world-beating campaign, he took along Callisthenes as his official historian. But while they were fighting their way through Persia, Callisthenes appears to have talked himself into a charge of treason, whereupon Alexander had him locked up in a portable cage. As Callisthenes trailed alongside the army in his cage, languishing in the desert heat, his body became covered with sores and crawling insects, until in the end Alexander became so sick of the sight of him that he threw him to a lion. But like all successful megalomaniacs, Alexander had his paranoid streak. He blamed Aristotle for Callisthenes' treachery. Alexander is said to have been on the point of signing orders for Aristotle's death, but in the end he set off to conquer India instead. After spending 5 years in Stagira, Aristotle returned to Athens. Then in 335 BC, Speusippus died, and the position of head of the academy once again fell vacant. This time it was given to Aristotle's old friend Xenocrates, who was considered a suitably austere and dignified character, despite having once been awarded a gold crown, for his prowess in drinking at the Feast of Pitchers. Xenocrates was to die in office 20 years later by tripping in the night and falling into a cistern. Aristotle was so miffed at being passed over once again that he decided to found a rival school of his own. This he established in a large gymnasium beyond the city walls beneath Mount Lycabettos. The gymnasium was attached to the nearby temple of Apollo Lysias, Apollo in the form of a wolf. Thus Aristotle's school became known as the Lyceum. The name lives on to this day, most appropriately in the French word lycée, though precisely why Aristotle's great school should also be commemorated in the names of ballrooms and theatres is not so clear. Aristotle's original Lyceum certainly taught a wide range of subjects, but ballroom dancing and acting were not to achieve full-fledged academic status until the 20th century in the American Midwest. The Lyceum was much more like a modern university than the academy. A new leader was elected to the student council every 10 days, separate faculties competed for students, and occasional attempts were even made to institute a schedule of classes. The Lyceum undertook research in the different sciences, passing on its findings to the students. The Academy was more interested in giving its students sufficient grounding in politics and law so that they could become future rulers of the city. The Lyceum was the MIT, or even the Institute of Advanced Studies, of its day, whereas the Academy more resembled 19th-century Oxford or the Sorbonne. The differences between the Lyceum and the Academy aptly illustrates the differences between the philosophies of Aristotle and Plato. Where Plato wrote the Republic, Aristotle preferred to collect copies of the constitutions of all the Greek city-states and select the best points from each. The Lyceum was the school that city-states turned to when they wished to have a new constitution written. No one tried to set up the Republic. Unfortunately, Aristotle's exhaustive study of politics had already been rendered practically redundant by none other than his worst pupil, Alexander. The face of the world was changing forever. Alexander's new empire was bringing about the end of the city-state, much as today continental confederations may well bring about the effective end of the independent nation-state. Neither Aristotle nor any of the galaxy of intellectuals gathered in the schools of Athens appear to have noticed this great historical change, an omission on a par with 19th-century intellectuals from Marx to Nietzsche failing to foresee the supremacy of the United States. Aristotle gave his lectures at the Lyceum while walking with his pupils, and hence his school of followers became known as the Peripatetics, those who walk up and down. Some, however, claim they received this name because their master gave his lectures in the sheltered arcade of the gymnasium, known as the Peripatos. Aristotle is credited with the founding of logic. It was over 2,000 years before a logician of similar calibre was to appear. He was a metaphysician almost on a par with Plato, and he surpassed his master in both ethics and epistemology. Despite this, Plato has the edge on him as an originator. Aristotle may have come up with the answers, but Plato was the one to see the basic questions which we should be asking in the first place. Aristotle's most significant achievement was in the field of logic. To all intents, he invented this subject. Aristotle came to see logic as the foundation on which all learning is based. Plato had understood that knowledge could be discovered by dialectic, conversational argument by means of question and answer, but it was Aristotle who formalized and advanced this method with his discovery of the syllogism. According to Aristotle, the syllogism showed that when certain things are stated, it can be shown that something other than what is stated necessarily follows. For example, if we make the following two statements, all humans are mortal, all Greeks are human, it can be inferred that all Greeks are mortal. This is logically necessary and undeniable. Aristotle distinguished between different types of syllogism involving negatives or limited cases, but they all had the same basic structure. Well over 2 millennia before biology made any effective advance on this notion, with Darwin's theory of evolution. By now, Aristotle had acquired a reputation as the leading intellectual throughout Greece. Philip of Macedon had recently overrun Greece, for the first time uniting its reluctantly. He set out for the Macedonian capital of Pella. Nowadays, Pella is little more than a field of stones, with some pebble mosaics and half a dozen columns, beside the busy main road from Thessaloniki to the western Greek border. It is a surprisingly unimpressive spot, considering that this was the first bickering city-states into one sovereign country, and he invited Aristotle to become tutor to his unruly young son Alexander. As Aristotle's father had been personal physician and friend to Philip's father, Aristotle was considered one of the family, and he felt obliged to accept this regal offer. Reluctant capital of ancient Greece, and later, after Alexander the Great launched his campaign to conquer the world, it could even have claimed to be the first and last capital of the known world. Here in 343 BC, one of the finest minds the world has ever known set about trying to educate one of the greatest megalomaniacs the world has ever known. Aristotle was 42 years old. Alexander was 13. But not surprisingly, it was Alexander who won hands down. The headstrong young pupil learned absolutely nothing from his tutor,